The Oxford Dictionary defines a consumer society as one in which the buying and selling of goods is the most important social and economic activity. Sometimes the modern world, with its endless cycle of work, eat, sleep, and work again, can feel empty and meaningless. So, how do we break free of that? Well, Michael Harris, author of All We Want Building the Life We Can't Buy, may well have the answer. Welcome to the City News Bookshelf, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
You write that your book is a survival pack for life beyond a consumer culture. What inspired you to write it?
So I grew up in the 1980s when consumer culture was really just, taking off. And I think, as a millennial, I was sort of promised a, a bigger, better life than my parents had, and my parents were going to have that bigger, better life than they had, right? It was all up, up, up. And then the promises of the 20th century kind of ran aground on the realities of the 21st century. On a selfish level, I wanted to know like why I didn't have what my parents had. But then as I began working on the book, it expanded into something much larger, right? Why did we think we were supposed to have this? And why were we so married to this genuinely untenable fantasy about infinite growth on a finite planet?
You write, my generation will be the last to read that shining, unadulterated fantasy about consumerism and the first to scan the shelves asking what comes next. So, what do you think does come next?
So consumer culture gives us this one idea of what life is about, right? You buy something and that's going to make you happy. That was the one story. What I wanted to know was what are the other stories about life's purpose or life's meaning? And what I came to were stories that exemplified what Aristotle talked about when he was talking about eudaimonia, this idea of thriving in your life. So it's not about getting something, it's about living something. So the kinds of alternative stories that the book is exploring are all about making, building, giving, as opposed to accumulating.
Now, do you find that there is a search for meaning among this generation, our generation, as you point out, compared to where their parents stood at 40? Millennials in the West have lower incomes, higher debts, and virtually no wealth to fall back on. That sounds pretty joyless to read it, to stand right out, doesn't it?
Well, but it's also an opportunity, right? Every time something disrupts what you thought you were supposed to have, that's an opportunity to look for other modes of being, right? And that's certainly what we need, right? Consumer culture, we now know, is a greater contributor to climate change than even population growth is. And there are billions more people who are going to be joining that consumer culture party over the next 20, 30 years, right? Our resource consumption is going to triple probably in the next 30 years. So we can't keep up that one fantasy of endless growth. The picket fence fantasy is just, it is untenable. And so using that kind of disappointment as a launch pad for finding other ways of measuring your days, I think is the only possible solution. We have to find other ways to be happy, other ways to find meaning in our lives.
I was struck by the many ways you point out in which we consume, both the obvious and not so obvious. The example that stuck out for me is the one you gave of the hit Despacito, how it was viewed 5 billion times on YouTube in its first year, consuming the same amount of energy at that rate as 40,000 American homes. Were you struck by that as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes the thing that consumer culture is so good at is invisibilizing the waste of what we consume, right? So watching a YouTube video, you might think this is just sort of an endless, or sort of harmless piece of consumption. But the reality is that there's a server somewhere consuming massive amounts of energy. There's always a piece of pollution at the other side. So yeah, in my research, I found countless examples of consumption that felt slick and easy on Amazon, for example, or just at the grocery stores, you pull something off the shelf. But if we were actually to carry home from the store all of the extra material that went into those tiny products that were in our bags, we'd have, a dump truck behind us. So yeah, trying to face up to the material facts of our consumption. It was one of the things I had to tackle right from the beginning of the book.
When we talk about climate change, there's a dark warning in a line like, news stories can be told by us or by the hurricanes. Essentially that, as you say, infinite growth on a finite planet will catch up with us sooner or later, likely sooner than later. Do you think there's still time for us to rewrite our story?
Yeah, so that's sort of, you're right, the darker subtext of the book. While the book is offering these alternative stories, these alternative ways of measuring your life, it doesn't necessarily say we're going to change our behavior and thus save ourselves from extreme climate change events. What may be more possible is that extreme climate change events radically alter our lifestyles for us over the coming century, right? So I don't know whether it's more us changing in order to prevent climate catastrophes, or whether climate catastrophes create change in us. It will probably be some mix of the two, and all we can do is try and push it toward the healthiest outcomes that we can get.
Now, the second half of the book kind of talks about those stories about how to put meaning back into our lives. Your philosophy of craft, sublime, and care: craft, the way the natural world is shaped by human hands; sublime, a relationship with the transcendent; and care for other people. How do we apply craft, sublime, and care to our daily lives?
I mean, I think they're all there waiting to be appreciated, right? I mean, craft can be anything from like baking a loaf of bread to knitting a scarf. The sublime you don't need to go whitewater rafting or see the northern lights. You can just look up and see the stars at night, or contemplate infinity. And care, I mean, everybody has someone that needs a meal dropped off, or a helping hand. I think it's not that these other ways of living are not there waiting to be experienced. It's that we haven't prioritized them. We haven't given them their full weight. These are. I think we have to remember that consumer culture is not natural. That it was invented over the course of a couple of centuries for very particular purposes. And these other ways of measuring your life are actually much older than consumer culture, and will outlast consumer culture on the other side as well.
How do you think COVID has ratcheted up this conversation? I mean, this is something that we've been kind of wrestling with already as a society. If you go back to things like ad busters, buy nothing day, but how has COVID kind of accelerated this march to rethinking our consumer culture?
It's a tricky question, because there was a moment at the beginning of COVID when everything shut down and everybody started baking sourdough bread, and all the jets were parked in their hangars, and our greenhouse gas emissions around the planet did dip. There was a moment where we sort of proved to ourselves you can make a change, but it was also an economic disaster, right? And things have bounced right back up, and the pandemic isn't even over yet, right? So I don't think that plagues are a good way to rectify things. But that's an example of the kind of pushback that Mother Nature is going to have if we don't fix things on our own. We probably don't want to use COVID as a model for ideal behavioral change.
Well, as you say, either we write the story or the hurricanes, or in this case, the virus writes it for us in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. So early on in the book, um, I hang out with one of the guys who wrote a sort of famous report called "The Limits to Growth," and he really impressed upon me just this idea that uh, you've got a finite number of resources on the planet, and you can't just have this hockey stick growth if there's not the fuel to supply it, right? So uh, yeah, it's actually it, the environmentalists have become the conservatives in a way. We are the ones who are arguing it is irrational. It is a fantasy to continue in this way. The last half a century or so has been this very radical departure from a sustainable path. And so even though people like to pretend that environmentalists are all sort of wacky minded leftists, I think we're actually the conservative ones in the room.
Ultimately, what do you hope folks get out of the book?
Well, it's not a 5 easy steps to save the planet. I don't believe the books should be prescriptions at all. I think they should be descriptions. Um, and that's what this book is. It's a description of a possible future. And I think if enough of us start believing in that possible future, we can begin to change voting patterns over in some, and those voting patterns can lead to uh, politicians that actually put human life ahead of GDP. That start creating policies to work against planned obsolescence, right? All these sorts of changes are possible. We know that we have levers to adjust our path. So that's what I hope. I hope that readers of the book will start to join a larger body that is demanding that better future.
The name of the book is All We Want, Building the Life We Can't Buy. It's available from Doubleday Canada. My thanks to author Michael Harris.